In the soot-covered workshops of Tudor England, long before the Industrial Revolution transformed the rhythm of labor, there existed a humble, painful, and eye-destroying occupation known as the hand pin maker. To the modern eye, a pin is a disposable item. But in 16th century England, every single pin was handcrafted through an excruciating process that consumed lives, crushed bones, and stole eyesight. A pin maker, usually a poor man or child, began his day by drawing brass wire, slicing it with primitive tools and filing sharp points by hand. Each point needed precision. Any mistake meant starting over. The work table was often dimly lit, causing them to lean in close and squint at microscopic tips. Thousands of repetitions followed, one pin after another, sharpened, headed with a tiny coil of brass that had to be hammered perfectly flat, then tumbled in bags of chalk and brown dust for polishing. The dust clung to everything: eyes, mouth, hair, lungs. The result was brass founder's ague, likely heavy metal poisoning, leaving these workers chronically ill. Children as young as 4 were employed because their tiny fingers could twist the delicate metal faster. By age 10, they could do the whole process. By 30, they were blind and crippled, cast aside like broken tools. And for what? A few pence a week. No medical help, no compensation, just brass dust in your chest and bent fingers that trembled even in sleep. But if you think staring into death through brass dust was horrible, step into the stone-cold churches of Tudor parishes and meet the dog whipper. Churches were the social center of Tudor life, and with people came dogs, dozens of them, disrupting sermons with barking, urination, or outright fights. The solution: one man with a whip and wooden tongs patrolling sacred halls, ready to strike. But dogs weren't the only targets. Sleeping parishioners, noisy children, and overly affectionate couples all faced the whip. A dangerous job, not only because angry pet owners might retaliate with fists, but because a bite from a nobleman's mastiff could end your career, or life. Whippers were sometimes dragged into legal disputes after hitting the wrong dog. The job lasted centuries, a symbol of bizarre British solutions to chaos. Still, the whip never stopped cracking, even as the pews modernized. And while this job was humiliation through discipline, nothing beats the horror of being an executioner's assistant. The moment of execution, the axe falling, is just the show. Behind the curtain, real horror waits. The assistant was the one who sharpened the axe, tested the wooden block, and bound the condemned's limbs. His job was to steady the screaming, struggling prisoner before their head was struck. If the executioner missed, the assistant sometimes had to hold the victim while multiple blows were delivered. Afterward, it got worse. The assistant collected the head, cleaned it, boiled it with cumin and salt to preserve it, then dipped it in tar. This wasn't just to stop rot. These heads were mounted on spikes above bridges and gates as warnings. If you were a traitor, your heart might be burned before the crowd. Your intestines dragged out while alive. And the executioner's assistant did all this. Death wasn't clean. It was sticky, heavy, and vile. And someone had to carry the weight, literally. For him, death wasn't an event. It was a shift, one of many, repeated over and over in blood-soaked clothes and nightmare memories. Now let's enter the roaring world of bear baiting, a brutal entertainment sport that filled arenas and emptied morals. At the center of it all stood the beerward, a man whose job was to train and torment bears. These weren't pets. They were tools of bloodsport. Beerwards began their career raising cubs, often after trapping them in the wild. Then came the training. Starvation, beatings, taunts, and cruelty designed to make them angry enough for the ring. On fight day, the beerward chained the bear to a central post, filed down its teeth and claws so it couldn't kill too fast, then unleashed a pack of dogs. Blood spilled quickly, but the beerward wasn't just a handler. He was in the ring, replacing dead dogs, pulling at the chain to provoke the bear, making sure the show continued. One mistake, one slip, and the bear would remember every beating. Many beerwards were mauled to death by their own animals. But society saw them as necessary. Bear baiting was entertainment. For the crown. For commoners. For cruelty. The stench of the pit stayed on their clothes, their souls, their graves. Now leave the ring and walk the streets, if you can call them that, of Tudor London. Welcome to the world of the raker. Streets weren't cobbled paths but open-air sewers. Without plumbing or organized sanitation, people dumped chamber pots from upper windows. Garbage, dead animals, and blood from butcher shops all accumulated. Rakers were hired to shovel it away, manually. They moved ankle-deep in rot. Rain turned streets into rivers of excrement. Horses bloated in the sun until they exploded, splattering maggots and gore across anyone near. The tools, rakes, shovels, and bare hands. The pay, miserable. The risk, disease, injury, and shame. Some rakers worked barefoot, their skin permanently blackened by rot. What they earned, they supplemented by sifting filth for valuables. Coins, cloth, anything. Raking wasn't a job, it was penance. And yet, someone had to do it, or London would drown in itself. And speaking of digging, meet the saltpeter man. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was vital for gunpowder. But England had no natural reserves. So, men were sent, by royal warrant, to dig up floors of homes, barns, even churches, looking for nitrate-rich soil. They weren't gentle. Saltpeter men would tear apart stone floors, rip wooden beams, and leave behind holes big enough to break ankles. People hated them, but they had royal authority. Saying no wasn't an option. Villagers sometimes attacked them with pitchforks. Some were killed. Still, the saltpeter men returned, driven by war demands and profit. The work was destructive, hated, and filthy. It ruined homes and reputations. And when they finished tearing apart your house, you were left to fix the damage, on your own dime. London, 1603. The plague returns like a reaper's shadow. Bodies pile up, fear chokes every street, and into this terror steps a woman with no mask, no gloves, no medical knowledge. Just eyes that have seen too much. She is the plague searcher. Typically poor, elderly women, they were hired to visit houses of the dead to determine if death was caused by plague. Their qualification, experience with corpses. Their tools, none. No protection, no sanitation. They were paid by the body, 4 pence for every inspection. Their job was to look for telltale signs. Blackened fingers, buboes under the arms, blood-flecked froth on the lips. They'd lift blankets, examine corpses in unventilated homes, where the air was heavy with disease. People feared them, believed they spread the plague themselves. Families would lie to them, beg them to say it wasn't the plague. Some bribed, others threatened. If they declared plague, the house was sealed. Quarantined. No one in, no one out. Entire households were condemned based on a searcher's word. Many searchers caught the plague and died. Others were lynched. But someone had to tally the dead. Someone had to count the cost of horror. Now step away from the silence of plague and into the stench of industry. Meet the woad dyer. The vivid blue dye used in royal robes and banners. It came from fermenting woad leaves in vats of human urine. The dyers stood for hours over boiling, frothing pits of stale urine and crushed plants. Queen Elizabeth banned woad dye production within 5 miles of her palaces because of the smell. The fumes, ammonia mixed with fermenting organic matter, burned eyes, lungs, and skin. Dyers wrapped rags around their faces, but nothing could block the stench. Skin turned blue-green. Nails fell off. Many went blind. The dye itself stained everything. Their hands, their hair, their homes. Dyers lived in isolated communities, shunned even by other workers. Children were used for stirring the vats, cheaper and more expendable. Many drowned, overcome by fumes and heat. But the dye was in demand. Nobility wanted rich color. So dyers kept stirring, kept dyeing, buried in shallow blue-stained graves near their toxic workshops. Now enter the kitchens of royalty. It's feast day at Hampton Court Palace. Roasted oxen, swans, venison, endless meat, all on giant spits. But these don't turn by magic. They turn because of children. Meet the spit boy, often naked to prevent their clothes catching fire. Spit boys were as young as 7. They crouched beside roaring hearths, turning meat for hours. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The boys wrapped wet rags around their hands, which dried out in minutes. If they stopped turning, even briefly, the roast burned, and they were beaten. If they collapsed from heat exhaustion, they were doused with water and put back to work. During major feasts, shifts lasted up to 18 hours. Burns were common. Skin blistered. Eyes swelled shut. They weren't cooks. They were sacrifices. When mechanical spit turners were invented, the boys were thrown out, used up before they reached adolescence. These were not kitchens. These were furnaces, and their labor was never tasted. Among the many trades that served Tudor fashion, none was more foul than that of the fuller. Wool, fresh off the sheep, was greasy, matted, and filled with impurities. To clean and soften it, it was soaked in fermented urine, collected from pots placed on street corners, and then stomped on for hours by human feet. Fullers climbed into these vats barefoot and began pounding. The ammonia broke down the lanolin in wool. It also broke down skin. Their feet blistered, cracked, and often turned raw. Infections were constant. The fumes, choking, acidic, caused coughing fits and lung damage. They weren't allowed to live inside city limits because of the stench. Some collapsed mid-stomp. Others died of respiratory failure. The job was usually done by the destitute, beggars, widows, or children. Public urine collection was a secondary income for the poor. Piss pots, placed on corners, became mini economies. And yet, every fine Tudor coat, every nobleman's robe, passed through those urine-filled vats, stepped upon by bare human feet. The irony: nobles had no idea. They wore garments cleaned in fermented waste. Speaking of nobles, meet the most exclusive servant in all of England, the groom of the stool. It sounds absurd, until you realize this man had direct access to the king's naked backside. His job: assist the king during bowel movements, clean him, and record details in a royal stool journal. This included color, consistency, frequency, and ease of evacuation. Why? Because a sick bowel meant a sick king. Access to these moments meant power. Only the most trusted nobles were selected. They were allowed to speak freely to the king in private. Political alliances were made over excrement. Grooms were often promoted to key government posts. Imagine a modern-day chief of staff who began by holding toilet paper. They handled the royal chamber pot, cleaned it, perfumed it, and kept records still held in British archives. One groom noted Henry VIII had green stools and difficulty passing waste. These notes were considered state secrets. The job lasted until the early 18th century, only ending as indoor plumbing and privacy evolved. But for centuries, wiping royal buttocks was a fast track to political power. And yet, nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the job at number 1. Enter the cesspit. Enter the night. Enter the Gong Farmer. In cities like London, sewage didn't flow, it sat. Cesspits collected human waste under buildings. And when they filled up, someone had to go in and shovel it out. Only at night, because the stench was so overpowering it was banned during daylight. Gong farmers climbed down into pits filled with rotting excrement, with nothing but a shovel and a lantern. Waist deep in human filth, they scooped it into buckets, then hauled it to carts that leaked all the way to the city outskirts. Toxic gases built up in these pits. Many passed out. Some died. One man, Richard the Raker, famously drowned in human waste. The smell never left. Gong farmers were banned from public inns. Some tried to mask the odor with herbs in their clothing. Nothing worked. They lived short, painful lives, shunned by the very society they saved from drowning in its own filth. Their pay: 2 shillings a night. Not enough for medicine. Not enough to forget. And yet, without them, cities would have collapsed under their own weight. These were the dirtiest, most dangerous, and most essential workers of their time. Forgotten, unloved, essential. So the next time your Wi-Fi drops or your boss schedules a meeting at 4:55 p.m., remember this: at least you're not knee-deep in human waste. At least no one expects you to stir a vat of fermented urine, or take notes on someone else's bowel movements. History is full of forgotten labor. Bloody, filthy, back-breaking labor. But it built everything. The palaces, the armies, the cities. And while these jobs have been wiped from the job boards of history, their impact remains in every law that protects us today. May the Gong Farmer, the Fuller, the Spit Boy, and all the rest in peace. Unmourned, unlamented, and most importantly, unrepeated. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.